Chapter 3, Key Issue 2, is about internal migration. So we'll be looking at how people are moving either between regions in the U.S., and we'll also look at some interregional migration in Russia, Canada, Brazil, and China. And we'll also look at intra-regional migration patterns. So interregional migration is when you're moving from one region to another. So you're going from one region of a country to another region of the country. So you're going from one region to a new one. Usually it's because of a perception or actual economic improvement. So historically in the U.S., we moved from the eastern coast out to the frontier land, like the go west, the westward expansion. People moved out there to look at to settle the huge amounts of available land. People also moved out there with a gold rush. And you learned about that migration. You should have, at least when you were in middle school. Today, most interregional migration is when people are moving from either more rural areas into more urban areas, or you're moving across the country to one of the population clusters. So you might be moving to Chicago. So you might be moving from Alabama to Chicago, or Idaho to New York, or Iowa to Los Angeles. The western expansion contributed to what we call a shift in the center of population. And so we went from having most of the people in the United States clustered on the eastern coast to kind of dispersing a little bit. And we still have our populations in the United States clustered along the coastlines, but it took it from people being settled primarily in that northeastern corridor to being spread out across the country. You can see this timeline that kind of shows you the trend in the westward expansion. So in 1790, right after the Revolutionary War, most people were up here in the northeastern coast. By 1840, they had crossed the Appalachian Mountains. Then they'd moved into the middle, like what we call the Midwest, right? They moved further into the Great Plains, and then they started to move south and further west. Here it shows you interregional migration patterns in 1995 and then today in 2010. And today you can see that it's a little less emphasized. So in 1995, there were a lot of people moving from the northeast to the west, from the west into the south, back from the south into the west. Lots of people moving from the Midwest down south, some vice versa. Lots of people moving from the northeast down further south. And today it's kind of balanced out a little bit more, so you don't quite see as many people moving around as we used to. So there's people moving around, but the patterns are more similar, I guess. So the interregional migration is a little bit more balanced. The world's 5 largest countries in land area, so not population size, but land area, are Russia, China, Canada, the U.S., and Brazil. And so let's look at migrations between the regions in these countries. So in Russia, interregional migration was encouraged. They want people to move east and north. So the government would locate new factories, and they would offer economic incentives to move people away from the existing population concentrations. And so people were already living down here near St. Petersburg and Moscow. And so this area closer to Europe and the Middle East are the population centers for Russia. And they want people to live, up here where it's really, really cold, and really far out east where there's not as many people. And so they would put factories up here and encourage people to move out there. And by encourage, sometimes forcefully. So I'm using the term encourage loosely. Like it was, they tried to make people do some compulsory work in these regions out here for a few years, hoping they would stay and settle. But the truth is it's really cold and isolated up here. So most people still live in this area in Russia today. Canada shares a similar east to west interregional migration pattern with the U.S. So you see people moving in a pretty similar time frame as well, from the east coast of Canada across the west coast. And some of the same motivations: lots of land to farm, land to hunt, and part of a gold rush there as well. In China, you see 100 million people moving from the rural interior of China to the urban areas along the eastern coast, where there's more manufacturing jobs, more service jobs, and more trade jobs. So they're moving from the interior of China to that coastal area. And there's a big difference in the quality of life and the availability of materials and services from the rural interior of China and the coastal areas. Similar to in Brazil, most people are already located along the coast. And in an effort to kind of space out the population more, kind of like Russia's idea, in Brazil, they moved the capital. So they relocated their capital from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia. And Brasilia is inland in Brazil. So they were hoping that would help people move from the coast to the inland area in Brazil. So they would have, they were able to distribute services a bit more. So here you can see from China, most people are moving from this rural interior area to these large port cities in the eastern coast. Intra-regional migration is when you move within a region. So if you're moving within the Midwest. So if I move from Indiana to Illinois, like it's intra-regional migration. So I'm not moving all the way across the country, I'm just shifting jobs. If you moved from Palm Beach County, you went to school in Gainesville, and you decided to get a job in Jacksonville, that's intra-regional migration. You're moving within the same area. Right now, we still have people moving from rural areas to urban areas. That was a trend that started in the 19th century. And so if you look at the U.S. population in 1800, 5% of the population lived in urbanized area. In 1920, 50% of the population. And in 2010, 80% of the population lived in urban areas. An urban area doesn't have to mean that you live like within the large city, but you live within the metropolitan area of a large city. So we are usually classified as living either in an urban area or suburban, depending on the scale of classification. People moved to these urban areas for economic advancement because they wanted jobs. They wanted jobs in factories. Today, most intra-regional migration in developed countries is from cities out to the surrounding suburbs. So it's not necessarily motivated by economic advancement, but a certain lifestyle. You want a larger house for the same amount of money. You want a yard. You want, a driveway. You want a car. You want your kids to go to suburban schools. You want a green lawn. You want to live in the suburbs. So if you look at this pattern here, you have most people moving from the city out to the suburbs. You do have a large trend growing where people are moving from the suburbs back to the city. And so this is kind of a newer phenomenon where people are moving back into the city because of the easy access to services and because you don't have to have a car. You can use public transportation. And you also see what's called counter-urbanization, where people are moving from a city back out to rural areas. But the biggest trend overall is from the cities to the suburbs still. During the late 20th century, rural areas started to be characterized by what's called net immigration, and that again is that counter-urbanization. And counter-urbanization was most common in places that have like beautiful national parks, like beautiful vistas. So places like Colorado, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, people move from cities and suburbs back out to rural areas because it's beautiful. There's a reason. There's a quality of life associated with it. And people might move into a rural area and work on a farm, or they might move into a rural area because they can work from home now. So if you're able to work from home, you can live anywhere you want. And this shows you the percentage of people moving in the United States, and it's starting to decrease a little bit. And so people still move around, but we don't have the marked patterns that we would have seen in the past. So here we would have seen the start of people moving from people who were living in the cities out to the suburbs, and it started to decrease by the 80s. So this is that great white flight we kind of talked about, and we talked about hip hop. There was a spike here between the 80s and 90s. People had a lot of money, they were moving around, and lately that trend has been decreasing.